Welcome to this journey through one of the most haunting traditions the Ozark Mountains ever witnessed within their isolated communities. In the rugged hills of Stone County, Missouri, where death was common and salvation uncertain, there existed a practice brought from the old country and adapted to New World needs. This story is inspired by the real Ozark and Appalachian tradition of sin-eating, where an outcast would be paid to consume a ritual meal over a corpse, symbolically taking on the dead person's sins so they could enter heaven unburdened. While this practice genuinely existed in the region, the specific events and characters in this story are fictional, created for entertainment purposes. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we delve into this dark narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The year 1892 marked a time when the Ozark Mountains held pockets of profound isolation, communities so remote that they maintained old-world traditions long after those practices had been abandoned in more settled regions. Stone County in southwestern Missouri was particularly isolated, its steep terrain and poor roads creating natural barriers that preserved cultural practices brought by immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, places where sin-eating had been practiced for centuries before being transported across the Atlantic. In these mountains, where death came frequently and the nearest ordained minister might be weeks away, communities needed ways to ensure their dead could enter heaven without the burden of earthly sins weighing down their souls. The practice of sin-eating was straightforward in its mechanics, but profound in its implications. When someone died before burial, the family would place a meal on the deceased's chest, usually bread and beer, or sometimes salt and water, depending on the family's means and the dead person's sins. The sin-eater would be summoned, usually living at the edges of the community in deliberate isolation, and would come to consume the meal in the presence of the corpse and the grieving family. By eating the food that had rested on the dead body, the sin-eater symbolically consumed the deceased's sins, taking them into his own soul and allowing the dead to pass into the afterlife purified and acceptable to divine judgment. The sin-eater would be paid a small sum, enough to sustain his marginal existence, and would return to his isolation, carrying the accumulated weight of community sins. In Stone County in the spring of 1892, the role of sin-eater was held by a man named Tobias Sharp, though few called him by his given name. He was known simply as the Sin-Eater, or sometimes more cruelly as the Devil's Plate, because of what he consumed. Tobias was 43 years old, having held his position for nearly 20 years, inheriting the role from an older man who had died without anyone else willing to assume the burden. He lived in a one-room cabin, positioned at the boundary between the loosely defined settlement area and the true wilderness, close enough to be reached when needed, but far enough that his presence did not trouble the daily life of decent people. Tobias had not always been an outcast. In his youth, he had been part of the community like anyone else, the son of a farmer, expected to work the land and raise a family. But circumstances had driven him to the margins. His father had died owing debts to several families, debts that fell to Tobias as the eldest son. Unable to pay, facing the prospect of lifelong servitude or exile from the community entirely, Tobias had made a desperate choice when the previous sin-eater died. He volunteered for a role that no one wanted, a position that guaranteed survival, but required absolute social isolation, because contact with a sin-eater was considered spiritually dangerous, as if his accumulated burden of sins might transfer to anyone who got too close. For 20 years, Tobias had performed his function with quiet dignity. He kept careful accounts of each sin-eating, noting the name of the deceased, the date, the payment received, maintaining records that no one else would ever read, but which seemed important to his sense that what he did had meaning beyond mere superstition. He had eaten sins at the corpses of over 200 people, old and young, righteous and wicked, taking into himself the accumulated transgressions of an entire community across 2 decades. And for 20 years, he had lived alone, speaking to others only when summoned for his service, existing on the margins of human society, bearing a burden that grew heavier with each ritual meal. The community's relationship with Tobias was complex and contradictory. They needed him desperately, could not imagine burying their dead without his services, yet they treated him with a mixture of fear, disgust, and barely concealed contempt. When he walked through the settlement to reach a home where death had occurred, people would turn away, making signs against evil, pulling children indoors as if his very presence might contaminate them. Money paid for his services would be left on the doorstep, never handed directly, as if even coins touched by a sin-eater carried spiritual danger. Food sold to him at the store would be placed on the counter without the merchant touching his hand, transaction completed through careful avoidance of any physical contact. Tobias endured this treatment because he had no choice, and because, somewhere in the depths of his isolated existence, he had convinced himself that what he did mattered, that by consuming sins he genuinely helped souls transition from earthly corruption to heavenly purity. He clung to this belief because, without it, his life had no meaning, his isolation no purpose, his suffering no redemption. He was performing a sacred service, he told himself during long nights alone in his cabin, even if that service required him to become the repository of evil that the community could not bear to carry itself. The winter of 1891-1892 was particularly harsh in the Ozarks, with snow falling early and deep, temperatures dropping to levels that killed livestock and made travel nearly impossible for weeks at a time. Death came frequently that winter, mostly the old and the very young, those whose bodies could not withstand the cold and the illnesses that thrived in close quarters when families huddled together for warmth. Tobias was summoned repeatedly, trudging through snow to remote cabins where corpses lay waiting, consuming ritual meals in freezing rooms, while families watched with hollow eyes, grateful for his service, but resentful of his necessary presence. By the time spring arrived in late March, Tobias had performed the sin-eating ritual 17 times in 4 months, far more frequently than usual. 17 meals consumed over 17 corpses, 17 collections of sins taken into his soul, adding to the burden of 200 previous ceremonies. And it was after that 17th winter death, after consuming sins over the body of an old man named Hezekiah Thorne who had died of pneumonia, that Tobias began to notice changes in himself. The first change was in his dreams. Tobias had always experienced disturbed sleep, which he attributed to the nature of his work and the isolation of his existence. But after that 17th winter sin-eating, his dreams took on a new quality. He dreamed of the people whose sins he had consumed, but not as he had known them in life. He dreamed of them committing the sins he had taken from them, saw their transgressions in vivid detail, experienced their shame and guilt and secret pleasures as if they were his own memories. He watched Hezekiah Thorne cheat his neighbors in land deals, saw the old man's calculated deceptions, felt the satisfaction Hezekiah had taken in his cleverness. These were not vague impressions, but concrete experiences, complete with sensory details that Tobias's conscious mind had no way of knowing. He began to wake each morning with memories that were not his own, knowledge of sins committed by people long dead, carried now in his mind as if he had lived multiple lives, each one stained by transgressions he had never actually committed, but which felt as real as any experience from his own biography. The boundaries between his identity and the identities of those whose sins he carried began to blur. He would catch himself thinking in dialect patterns that belonged to dead people, using phrases they had favored, experiencing emotional responses to situations that reflected not his own temperament, but the temperaments of those whose spiritual corruption he had consumed. The second change was physical. Tobias had always been lean, his isolated existence and marginal diet keeping his body spare and functional. But after that 17th winter sin-eating, he began to put on weight despite eating no more than usual. His body thickened, his face became heavier, his movements slower and more ponderous. When he looked at himself in the small mirror he kept for shaving, he sometimes saw features that were not quite his own, as if other faces were superimposed over his reflection, the visages of the dead whose sins resided in his soul, making their presence visible in his flesh. By April, Tobias had gained what he estimated as 30 pounds, his clothes no longer fitting properly, his body changing shape in ways that disturbed him. His hands were thicker, his fingers shorter and blunter than they had been. His neck had developed folds of flesh that had not existed before. His eyes, when he could bear to look at them in the mirror, seemed darker, as if the pupils had expanded to consume the iris, leaving only black depths that reflected no light. The third change was in his voice. Tobias had always been a quiet man, speaking rarely, his voice soft and somewhat hesitant after years of minimal conversation. But now his voice would shift unpredictably, taking on the tones and cadences of people he had never met in life, but whose sins he carried. He would speak in the harsh rasp of Hezekiah Thorne, or the high nervous pitch of a young woman who had died in childbirth, or the slow drawl of a farmer who had succumbed to fever. These shifts were involuntary and disturbing, as if his vocal cords had become instruments that multiple users could play, each dead soul asserting its presence through the medium of his speech. The community noticed these changes, though they interpreted them through the lens of their existing prejudices and superstitions about sin-eaters. Tobias was becoming corrupted by his work, they whispered, the accumulated sins physically transforming him into something monstrous. This was the natural consequence of carrying so much evil, they told each other, confirming their belief that sin-eating, while necessary, was spiritually dangerous, and that those who performed it were inevitably damned by their own service. But Tobias understood, with growing horror, that something more specific was happening. The sins he consumed were not merely symbolic. They were not metaphorical weights on the soul that could be balanced by prayer and repentance. They were concrete, tangible things that took up residence in his body and mind, changing him from the inside, gradually erasing Tobias Sharp and replacing him with an amalgamation of all the people whose transgressions he had consumed. He was becoming a living repository of the community's moral corruption, a physical manifestation of their collective sins, and the process was accelerating. In May, death claimed 3 more members of the community in quick succession. Child drowned in a swollen creek. An elderly woman died in her sleep. A young man was killed when a tree he was felling fell in an unexpected direction. 3 more summons for the sin-eater. 3 more ritual meals. 3 more collections of sins to consume. Tobias fulfilled his function because he knew no other way to live, because his identity had become so intertwined with his role that to refuse would be to cease existing in any meaningful sense. But after consuming the sins of the young man killed by the falling tree, a man named Samuel Weston, who had been 26 years old and whose sins included adultery and theft and casual cruelty to those weaker than himself, Tobias experienced something that pushed him beyond the boundaries of his deteriorating sanity. He dreamed that night not as an observer of Samuel's sins, but as Samuel himself, living through the young man's transgressions as if they were Tobias's own actions. He felt the excitement of forbidden sexual encounters, the satisfaction of taking things that did not belong to him, the pleasure of asserting dominance over others. And when he woke, gasping in his dark cabin, Tobias realized that part of him had enjoyed those experiences, had taken pleasure in sins he himself had never committed, but which now lived in his memory as vividly as if he had. This was the true horror of his situation. He was not merely carrying the weight of others' sins. He was becoming capable of those sins himself, his moral boundaries eroding as the accumulated transgressions reshaped his character, his ethical framework dissolving under the weight of 220 separate collections of human corruption. Tobias Sharp, who had been a quiet and fundamentally decent man, driven to his marginal existence by circumstances rather than by evil nature, was being transformed into something else, something that contained multitudes of moral failures, all of them becoming part of his essential being. The physical changes accelerated. By June, Tobias barely recognized himself. His body had become grotesque, swollen in some places and wasted in others, as if different parts of him were responding to different influences, each dead person whose sins he carried claiming some territory of his flesh. His face was a nightmare of conflicting features, his left side appearing much older than his right, his eyes at different levels, his mouth twisted as if multiple expressions were fighting for dominance. When he walked, his gait was irregular, sometimes lurching like an old man with bad joints, sometimes striding with youthful confidence, his body unable to maintain a consistent mode of movement because it was trying to embody too many different people simultaneously. His cabin became a place of horror even to himself. He would wake to find that he had written things during the night in handwriting that was not his own, confessions of sins in the voices of dead people, as if they were using his hands to record their transgressions, creating documents of their moral failures that no one would ever read. The walls of his cabin became covered with these automatic writings, layer upon layer of sins described in meticulous detail, creating a comprehensive catalog of human wickedness that surrounded Tobias in his isolation. He began to hear voices, not the internal voices of thought, but actual audible voices speaking around him in his empty cabin, the voices of the dead whose sins he carried, arguing among themselves, pleading for recognition, demanding that he acknowledge their presence and their stories. Some wanted forgiveness, others wanted to justify their actions. Still others simply wanted to be heard, to have their sins witnessed and validated, rather than buried in anonymous consumption by a sin-eater who was supposed to take their corruption away, but who had instead become their eternal host. The community, unaware of the full extent of Tobias's deterioration, continued to summon him when death occurred. They needed him, could not imagine managing their dead without his services, and the fact that he appeared increasingly monstrous only confirmed their belief in the necessity of keeping such a creature at the margins of society. If sin-eating caused such corruption, they reasoned, then the sin-eater must be completely separated from decent people, his contamination contained and controlled. It was in July that the community's relationship with Tobias reached a crisis point. A respected elder named Jacob Pritchard died, and his family summoned the sin-eater to perform the customary ritual. Tobias came, as he always did, trudging to the Pritchard home in the evening, his misshapen body struggling with movement that had once been effortless, his mind fractured and barely holding together the fragments of who he had been. The ritual proceeded normally at first. the family placed bread and beer on Jacob's chest. Tobias stood beside the corpse, preparing to consume the meal and take on whatever sins the old man had carried. But when Tobias reached for the bread, something unprecedented happened. He began to speak, but not in his own voice, or even in the voice of one of the dead whose sins he carried. He spoke in the voice of Jacob Pritchard, the corpse lying before him, and the words he spoke were a confession of sins so terrible that the family recoiled in horror. Jacob had not been the righteous elder he appeared. He had stolen from neighbors, seduced other men's wives, beaten his own wife in secret, cheated his business partners, and committed acts of casual cruelty that he had hidden behind a facade of respectability. These sins poured out of Tobias's mouth in Jacob's voice, a complete confession that the dead man would never have made voluntarily, revealed now because somehow the act of sin-eating had created a connection between Tobias and the corpse, before the sins had even been formally consumed. The family was shocked and outraged, insisting that Tobias was lying, that he was slandering their dead patriarch. But others in the room recognized truth in what was being revealed. Small incidents and inconsistencies that had never quite made sense suddenly became clear in the light of Jacob's exposed corruption. The confession continued for nearly 10 minutes, a comprehensive catalog of a life lived in secret wickedness while maintaining public virtue, and when it finally ended, Tobias collapsed, having served as the vehicle for a dead man's unburdening. The family drove Tobias from their home without payment, threatening him with violence if he ever spoke of what had happened. But word spread through the community with the speed of scandal. The sin-eater had revealed Jacob Pritchard's hidden sins, had spoken in the dead man's voice, had violated the unspoken agreement that sins consumed were sins silenced. The community's relationship with Tobias had always been based on the understanding that he took away their sins and buried them in his corrupted soul where they could be forgotten. But if sin-eating now meant exposure rather than concealment, if the dead's transgressions would be revealed rather than hidden, then the entire practice became threatening rather than comforting. A meeting was held at the small church that served the scattered community. Tobias was not invited, but he was the sole subject of discussion. Some argued for driving him away entirely, sending him into deeper wilderness where he could trouble them no more. Others pointed out that they still needed a sin-eater, that their dead could not enter heaven with sins uncleansed. A few voices, quieter and more thoughtful, suggested that perhaps what had happened was not Tobias's fault, that he had served them faithfully for 20 years, and that his current state was the direct result of the burden they had placed on him, that they bore some responsibility for his corruption, because they had used him as their spiritual refuse pit. But this latter view found little support. It was easier to see Tobias as the problem, as something that had gone wrong, rather than as something they had broken through their use of him. The meeting concluded with a compromise. Tobias could remain in his cabin and continue his function, but he was to be even more rigorously isolated, forbidden from entering the main settlement under any circumstances, summoned only when strictly necessary, and sent away immediately after performing his services. Tobias learned of these decisions through messages left at his cabin. He did not protest. He barely understood anymore what protesting would mean, his sense of self so fragmented that he could not muster the unified will required to resist, or even to object. He continued to exist in his cabin, surrounded by the voices of the dead, his body continuing its grotesque transformation, his mind splintering further with each passing day. August brought more deaths and more summons. A young mother died in childbirth. A boy was bitten by a snake and succumbed to the venom. An old man simply failed to wake one morning. 3 more sin-eatings, 3 more collections of transgressions taken into Tobias's already overstuffed soul. And with each ritual meal, the barrier between Tobias and the dead whose sins he carried became thinner, until he was no longer clear about which experiences were his own and which belonged to the ghosts that inhabited him. He began to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Part of him was Tobias Sharp, the 43-year-old sin-eater trying desperately to hold together the fragments of his identity. But other parts of him were the 223 dead people whose sins he had consumed, each one claiming some fraction of his consciousness, each one trying to assert their presence and their story through the medium of his increasingly permeable mind. He would find himself speaking in conversations with people who were not there, arguing with voices that only he could hear, defending actions he had never taken, confessing sins he had never committed except through the strange alchemy of his role. The community began to avoid even indirect contact with Tobias. Children were told stories about the sin-eater that transformed him into a monster, a cautionary tale about the consequences of sin and the importance of moral living. Adults who caught glimpses of him on his increasingly rare ventures from his cabin would make signs against evil and whisper prayers for protection. He had become not merely an outcast, but something closer to a demon, a physical embodiment of everything the community feared about moral corruption and spiritual damnation. It was in September that Tobias made a decision born from the few remaining fragments of his original self that still functioned coherently. He would not perform the sin-eating ritual anymore. He would refuse the next summons, would decline to take on additional sins, would try to hold on to what little remained of Tobias Sharp before he was completely erased by the accumulated weight of 223 dead people's transgressions. It was an act of desperate self-preservation, a final attempt to maintain some boundary between himself and complete dissolution. The test of his resolution came quickly. In late September, a prominent farmer named Elijah Moss died, and his family sent word to Tobias that his services were required. Tobias did not respond. He remained in his cabin, trying to ignore the summons, trying to convince himself that he had the right to refuse, that his own survival mattered more than the community's need for his function. But the family sent word again, more insistent. And when Tobias still did not come, they sent men to his cabin to demand his compliance. The confrontation was ugly and desperate. Tobias tried to explain that he could not continue, that taking on more sins would destroy what little remained of himself, that he was not refusing out of malice, but out of a basic instinct for survival. But the men who had come for him were not interested in his explanations. They needed a sin-eater. Elijah Moss needed his sins consumed so he could enter heaven, and Tobias's personal concerns were irrelevant compared to the eternal fate of a righteous man's soul. They forced Tobias to come with them, physically dragging him from his cabin and compelling him to fulfill his function. He struggled weakly, his transformed body lacking the strength to effectively resist, his fragmented mind unable to organize a coherent defense. They brought him to the Moss home, where Elijah's corpse lay in state, where the family waited with the ritual meal prepared, where the entire community seemed to be watching to see whether their sin-eater would perform his duty or whether he had truly become too corrupted to serve. Tobias stood before the corpse, looking at the bread and beer placed on Elijah Moss's chest, feeling the weight of all the sins he already carried pressing down on him like physical mass. And he knew that if he consumed this meal, if he took on Elijah's sins as he had taken on 223 others, he would cease to exist as Tobias Sharp in any meaningful way. The accumulation would be complete. He would become nothing but a vessel for community corruption, a living tomb for dead people's moral failures, with no self left to call his own. But he also knew that he had no choice. The community would not release him from his role. They needed their sin eater, and whether he survived the functions psychologically or spiritually was irrelevant compared to their need to ensure their dead could enter heaven. And so, with something close to final despair, Tobias reached for the bread. As his fingers touched the loaf, something happened that no one had anticipated. The corpse's eyes opened. Elijah Moss, who had been dead for 2 days, whose body had been washed and prepared for burial, looked directly at Tobias with clear recognition. And when the corpse's mouth opened, it was Tobias's own voice that emerged. The original voice he had possessed before 20 years of sin-eating had corrupted and fragmented it. "I see you," the corpse said in Tobias's voice. "I see what you carry. I see all of them inside you. You have become the repository of our collective shadow, the place where we bury what we cannot bear to acknowledge about ourselves, and you are dying under that weight." The family and the watching community members stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Tobias stared at the corpse that spoke with his voice, and in that moment he understood something that perhaps should have been obvious years before. He was not simply taking on sins through a symbolic ritual. He was absorbing actual spiritual essence, actual fragments of the dead people themselves, taking them into his soul and giving them continued existence within the confines of his corrupted being. He was not a sin-eater. He was a soul-eater, consuming the very essence of the dead to allow them to pass on, and those essences were destroying him from within. The corpse's eyes closed, and Elijah Moss was truly dead once more, having used some final reserve of spiritual energy to deliver a message that Tobias needed to hear. The community, shaken by what they had witnessed, backed away from both the corpse and the sin-eater, suddenly uncertain about the nature of the ritual they had been performing for generations, suddenly questioning whether what they called sin-eating was something far more terrible than they had imagined. Tobias did not consume the ritual meal. He turned and walked out of the Moss home, past the shocked family, past the frightened community members, returning to his cabin with a clarity of purpose he had not felt in years. He would not be a sin-eater anymore. He would not consume another soul. If the community needed that function performed, they would have to find someone else, or learn to live without it. Back in his cabin, surrounded by the voices of 223 dead people, Tobias made final preparations. He gathered all the writings that covered his walls, all the automatic confessions and recorded sins, and he built a fire in the yard outside his cabin. He fed the papers to the flames, watching as decades of accumulated moral corruption turned to ash and smoke. And as the papers burned, he felt a lightening, a sense that by destroying the physical records he was somehow releasing the hold that the dead had on him. The fire burned through the night, and Tobias stood watching it, feeling the voices in his head growing quieter, the presence of the dead becoming less insistent. As dawn broke, revealing the smoldering remains of the fire, Tobias felt more like himself than he had in months, as if the act of refusal and the burning of the sin records had begun a process of reclaiming his identity from the fragments that had threatened to dissolve it completely. But he knew his relief was temporary. The dead whose sins and souls he had consumed were still within him, still claiming territory in his corrupted flesh and fragmented mind. He would never be fully free of them, but perhaps he could learn to coexist with them, to maintain some core of Tobias Sharp amidst the multitude of voices and memories and sins that he carried. Perhaps he could survive his service, rather than being destroyed by it. The community's reaction to Tobias's refusal was complex and divided. Some were angry, insisting that he had no right to abandon his role, that the community's spiritual needs superseded his personal suffering. Others were quietly relieved, having been disturbed by what they had witnessed at the Moss home, willing to let the practice of sin-eating lapse rather than continue something that clearly involved forces darker and more complex than they had understood. No replacement sin-eater was found. When deaths occurred in the following months, families dealt with their dead through prayers and traditional Christian burial, hoping that divine mercy would be sufficient without the mediation of a sin-eater to consume and carry away their transgressions. Some claimed that their dead rested less easily without the ritual, that strange occurrences happened around graves where sins had not been properly eaten. Others insisted that the dead were fine, that sin-eating had always been superstition, that Christian faith alone was adequate for salvation. Tobias lived on in his cabin at the margins of the settlement, existing in a strange state between isolation and connection. He rarely saw living people, but he was constantly surrounded by the dead, whose essence he had consumed, their voices and memories and sins a permanent part of his consciousness. He had become, in a very real sense, a living cemetery, a place where 223 people continued to exist in fragmentary form, their moral failures and spiritual essence preserved within the ruined vessel of his body and mind. Some in the community viewed him with continued fear and disgust. Others, particularly those who had lost family members whose sins Tobias had consumed, felt a strange gratitude, mixed with their revulsion, recognizing that he carried their loved ones in some fashion, that through him those dead people had a kind of continued existence that transcended the purely physical grave. This ambivalent relationship continued for years, the community unable to fully reject Tobias, but unable to fully embrace him either, treating him as a necessary evil that had perhaps outlived its necessity, but could not be completely eliminated. As Tobias aged, his body continued to bear the marks of his service. He remained physically grotesque, his form shaped by the accumulated essence of over 200 dead souls. But he developed a kind of peace with his condition, accepting that he would never again be simply Tobias Sharp, that he was and would remain a composite being, a community of the dead carried in a single corrupted body. He lived another 16 years after his final refusal to sin-eat, dying in 1908 at the age of 59, his death noted briefly in county records but marked by no ceremony and attended by no mourners. His cabin was burned by community decision shortly after his death, as if by destroying the physical structure they could eliminate any lingering spiritual contamination. The land where it had stood was left vacant, acquiring a reputation as unlucky, a place where normal life would not take root. But those who passed near the site on certain nights claimed to hear voices, multitudes of voices speaking simultaneously, as if the 223 souls that Tobias had consumed had been released by his death, and now lingered in the place where their consumer had lived, unable to move on because they had been so thoroughly absorbed and transformed by the process of sin-eating. The practice of sin-eating did not survive Tobias's refusal. The tradition that had been brought from the old country and maintained for generations in the isolated Ozarks finally lapsed, replaced by more conventional Christian burial practices as the region slowly connected to wider society and modernized its spiritual understanding. But the memory of the sin-eater persisted, transformed into legend and cautionary tale, a story about the dangers of bearing others' burdens, about the cost of serving as the repository for community corruption, about what happens when one person tries to carry too much moral weight. The Stone County records contain only minimal mention of Tobias Sharp, a few entries noting his existence on the margins of the settlement, his payments received for services rendered, his death, and the disposal of his property. But the oral history of the region preserves more detailed accounts, passed down through families, embellished and modified with each retelling, but maintaining certain consistent elements. The sin-eater, who took on too much, whose body and mind were destroyed by his service, who finally refused, and in that refusal perhaps saved what little remained of his soul. Modern researchers who study Ozark folklore have documented the sin-eating tradition as a genuine historical practice, not merely legend or superstition, but an actual ritual that was performed in isolated communities well into the early 20th century. They note that the role of sin-eater was always marginal and dangerous, that those who served in that capacity paid a heavy price in social isolation and psychological burden. But whether any historical sin-eater experienced the extreme transformations attributed to Tobias Sharp, whether the ritual actually involved the consumption of spiritual essence rather than merely symbolic absorption of sins, remains a matter of debate and speculation. What is certain is that the practice reflected deep anxieties about sin, death, and salvation, about the moral weight that communities carry collectively, and the need to externalize and eliminate that weight through scapegoating rituals. The sin-eater served as the community's shadow self, the repository of everything they could not bear to acknowledge about their own moral failures, allowing them to maintain an illusion of collective righteousness by projecting their sins onto a designated outcast who would carry that burden in their place. The story of Tobias Sharp, whether historically accurate in its specifics or embellished into legend, captures the essential tragedy of this practice. It asks what happens to those who serve as repositories for others' moral corruption, what cost they pay for performing a function that the community needs but cannot respect, what transformation occurs when one person tries to carry the accumulated sins of hundreds. And it suggests that some burdens are too heavy to bear, that some services exact prices too terrible to pay, that there are limits to how much one's soul can hold before it breaks under the weight of accumulated darkness. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the darkest traditions the Ozark Mountains ever practiced. The sin-eater served his community faithfully until that service destroyed him. Consumed from within by the very sins and souls he had consumed, transformed into something that was no longer human in the singular sense, but rather a composite of hundreds of dead people's moral failures. His story reminds us that scapegoating has costs, that externalizing our darkness onto designated others does not eliminate that darkness, but merely relocates it, and that those who serve as repositories for community corruption pay prices that the community rarely acknowledges or values. The practice of sin-eating is gone from the Ozarks, abandoned as superstition, replaced by beliefs that do not require one person to serve as the vessel for collective moral failure. But the questions it raised remain relevant. How do we deal with the darkness in ourselves and our communities? What happens when we project our sins onto others rather than confronting them directly? What do we owe to those who serve as repositories for the parts of ourselves we cannot face? These are questions without easy answers, questions that perhaps the sin-eater understood better than anyone, having lived them in the most direct and terrible way possible. If you've made it this far on this journey through the shadow practices of Stone County, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the dark traditions of isolated communities. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and if this story resonated with you in any way, like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate folklore, transformed into something deeper and more unsettling. Until our next journey into the practices that communities would rather forget, drive safely and remember that the sins we try to eliminate by projecting them onto others never truly disappear. They merely relocate, and someone, somewhere, always pays the price for carrying what the rest of us refuse to bear.